I'm very curious about the underlying fascinations that led you across different levels of education. And I'm also very curious about the body of knowledge that you've collected about education holistically by having all of these different experiences. When you work with kids at all of these different age levels and in different places of their journey, you get a very holistic
Hmm.
perspective of how one thing begets another, how one thing affects another, what foundational pieces are important to make sure you're getting right, to see them positively expressed at later levels. And I'm very curious about how this, both what drove this from the beginning, if this was part of what you were seeking in
Yeah.
working at different levels, and also how it has affected your overall philosophy of education to have had such an unusually broad array of experiences.
Oh, definitely. I mean, it's interesting. You've hit on the head, the exact issue. So, one of the things that was on my mind, I had been teaching in, I had taught during graduate school. So I basically, at the end of my undergraduate education, starting the first year of graduate school, I was TA and I was teaching. So I've always been in the classroom. And one of the, one of the interesting things when I first started graduate school, this is pretty funny for anybody that knows, my sort of body of work. I had the misimpression that I would do the teaching thing because it was part of the job, but I really wanted to just write, 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 write. And as soon as I got into a classroom, I had tutored and I had done other, kinds of teaching in college and earlier, but I got into a classroom and I was captivated. The best advice I ever had when I was a college student, I had no idea what I was going to do. I mean, I truly, I wasn't sure whether I was going to go to graduate school or law school or whatever. I had a professor that I was friends with uh, that gave me the piece of advice that he said, don't think about the profession. Don't think about the career. Don't think about the job title of what you want to do. Focus instead on spending some time reflecting on the kinds of things that you like to do, the tasks, the types of intellectual challenges. Are you a person who likes to take a lot of discrete information and put it together? Are you a synthesizer? Or are you a person who likes to learn new things? Do you like to do the same thing over and over? All that kind of, day to day activity. And he said, then once you get a really good sense of who you are about those kinds of things, and for me, it was I loved learning new things. I loved exposing myself to new ideas. I loved explaining things, telling stories, etc. And to me, that all added up to okay. Well, what kinds of professions does this feature the most prominently? And a professor was a natural sort of outlet for that. So that's what I pursued. And I did it for I guess it was about more than a decade, so maybe 10, 12 years. And my assessment of and and as I said, I had been at Duke, so I had some of, the very academically considered best students in the country. Clemson is a very good school, but it's a state school, so it gets a wider array of educational backgrounds. I taught in the summers at Georgetown University through the Fund for American Studies, which brings students in from universities all over the country. So really a wide array of students. And one of the things that I began to observe about students at university level in particular was that in a certain way, I felt like I was a provider of information rather than someone who was shaping them. So, what I mean by this is that I used to joke that, college students kind of arrive on campus already half baked in the sense that a lot of the fundamental things about their thinking methods, about their approach to knowledge, about their moral character, or about their human development more broadly, has already been set in a way that although you can affect that trajectory, and you can certainly facilitate them discovering new things and kind of finding out new ways of going about their lives, you're not as fundamentally involved in shaping it. And so that was part of what was so attractive to me to teach younger students was that they were at an earlier stage that they still were discovering so much about being conscious of their own thinking methods of understanding how to approach different fields. That they were in a sense they were still more open to a wider range of approaches, because they hadn't yet been shaped in that way. And so when I got to the middle school teaching, that immediate, I mean, that was obvious that I was right about that these students. The other thing is I saw them every day. I went to recess with them. I ate lunch with them. As a middle school teacher in a small, private Montessori school, you get to know the students really well. They get to know you really well, and you feel like there's a much more of a mentorship aspect to your relationship. And I saw students develop, in a way that I hadn't, because you see them a couple times a week for 15 weeks in a semester at university. That's a little bit different now with the Lyceum program, which I'll, again, keep promising I'll get to. But um, and so that was really rewarding seeing, especially at adolescence. I know a lot of people when I left university teaching and said, "Oh, I'm going to go teach middle school." They were like, "Oh my gosh, adolescents, are you
Good
crazy?" But
luck.
yeah, no, no, but adolescence. I mean, I was in a, I was in a, Orange County, California private school, so very self-selected in a certain way. But we had scholarships. We had kids that weren't just elite rich kids or whatever. Um, but as well, I think what I learned so much in my Montessori training at the adolescent level is that adolescence is it's an incredibly interesting time in human development. It's the main, what Montessori identified, and what I think cognitive psychology has laid out, and sort of demonstrated in more sophisticated ways, perhaps, or at least more publishable research ways, than she did, is that adolescence is a time where there's a significant amount of self formation that's going on, right? That early childhood, what Montessori called the sensitive periods of the absorbent mind, when children are first learning how to master sensory information and to process that and to start to become conceptual. And then the transition to childhood, with sort of 6 to 12 period, children are, I mean, anyone who has children this age, no, they're just absorbers of information in a way that's different from the sensory and physical absorption of the early ages. They are just the why questions. They're curious. They want to know the world beyond themselves. Like I always say that a child in a 3 to 6 year old classroom is wants to know how to read a clock, right? They see a clock in the classroom and they're like, "What is that? I want to know what that is." A child at the 6 to 12 age wants to know why we know that it's 11:30 in one time zone, but 3:30 in another. Like, who figured that out? They start to globalize their interest. And then adolescence is a turning back inward, right? I mean, we all know this. Puberty hits, you become awkward, your body starts growing, all of these developmental changes are happening. But it's also a time when human beings naturally start to ask the question, what kind of person am I? In the childhood phase, they're still thinking about what's out there in the great big world. But as an adolescent, they start to ask themselves, who am I? What kind of a person am I? They start to become more self introspective. And they also start to get to that age, which frustrates a lot of parents and maybe a lot of teachers as well, where they realize that a large part of the world that they've learned about is actually based upon choices that previous human beings and civilizations have made. And that in some way makes that contingent. And it in some way makes them feel incredibly empowered that they can have an impact on the world, that they can change the world, that they can make those decisions in the future. And so they start testing and exploring and doing all those things. So it was really fascinating to me to contemplate, as a guide in those classrooms to teach those students, to facilitate their ability to, in a sense, dream big about what they wanted to do with their lives. Um, and you know, I had seen that in bits and pieces in some of my students at the university level, um, but not completely, right? And so that was incredibly rewarding. As a head of school, I confess, the favorite classroom for me to visit was a toddler classroom, a 2 and 3 year old, 18 to 3 year old classroom. Now, in many ways, Montessori describes that this is a parallel phase of development to adolescence, and so maybe that's one of the reasons. But for me, what toddlers do when they're mastering their own environment and the look of joy on their face, for example, when they first can use a spoon the right way, or you know, or even the constructive phases of their repetition. What Montessori describes, that if a parent or a guide, someone interacting with this child, is willing to observe and not intervene, right, and which is a huge part of Montessori, is letting the child develop themselves and facilitating that rather than constructing a child. They construct themselves. But watching them, for example, toddlers are endlessly repeating tasks that seem as though they've mastered them, right? They can do it. And as an adult, you want them to move on to the next skill. You want them to scale up, right? Because of the probably the educational drive to just, constantly move to the next thing. But they keep repeating the same action. And what's interesting is that Montessori points out, because they're not yet fully verbal in their native tongue, they can't tell us what they're doing, and they may not even be able to give an account of it. They may not be reflective enough at that age to give an account of it. But what it is that they're doing is that there's something about their own development that's telling them there's a purpose to this, right? It may be that they're experimenting, that they're learning more about the world, they're understanding causality at a deep level by repeating things. And what it was just fascinating for me to observe in those classrooms. I mean, watching the children in primary, learn language, and when they first learn how to write themselves, and the kind of fascination on their face when they realize, like, oh my gosh, I can transcribe my thoughts, and then they get to doing that, and it's like, wow, you have some interesting thoughts. Um, but, I think what Montessori gave me, by doing that, and by, as you said, sort of jumping around the divides, the somewhat arbitrary divides of education age-wise, is that by the time I got back to, college education and reentered a classroom, I was all the more aware of, I suppose, what different students were actually arriving at, right? That before I thought, okay, they take a class, they get some information, they do a paper, they do a test, and they move on. I was more attuned and aware of, I guess, what Montessori calls developmental tendencies, right? These areas where students have different parts of, by the time they reach, 17, 18 years old and they're in college, different parts of their personality that they're still forming out. And then importantly, in the area of sort of 18 to 24, that last phase of formation, their moral development. And so that actually lets me pivot to one of the really cool things about what we do. So I mentioned a couple times now the Lyceum program here at Clemson. So what was initially just a program that Brad Thompson had come up with as a way of, when he and I were here in the early years, we taught classes, we hosted lectures, we attended conferences, hosted conferences, and we were just trying to figure out what it was that we could do that was really unique. And we had students who were really desperate to take multiple classes with us, but we could only teach so much. And Brad eventually came up with this idea, like, what if we had an academic program that was in parallel to what students do for their academic major, that focused on the ideas that we cared about the most. So what the Lyceum program does is it is effectively, what we describe it as, is it's a great books approach to exploring the foundations of a free society. So the political, sort of the foundations of American political system, capitalism, and most importantly, I think, the formation and roots of moral character in a person. And so what we do is the students take 8 classes. We recruit students as scholars. They get a scholarship. We have 10 scholars every year. Some years we've had 20 when we get additional grants, but we have 10 scholars every year, and they come in and they matriculate as a cohort. They take these 8 classes together across their 4 years here. They do Socratic tutorials, which is where they meet with us one-on-one every other week to talk about moral character, to talk about the ideas, the important ideas that they learn in the classroom, and how to translate them into the real world, into their lives. And in effect, what it is for me is like, it's like almost like a St. John's experience, like St. John's College, within a larger university where students can still do, for example, we have mechanical engineering majors or economics majors or whatever. I mean, in a way, it's trying to balance out one of the things that has gone awry in the modern university, which is that it's hyper specialized, career focused, and um, unfortunately, like a lot of earlier education, is cut off from the idea of students being engaged in thinking about big questions. And so when I came back, I was excited to come back to the Lyceum program because it does focus a lot. I mean, I spend, hours every week talking to students one on one about morality, and I teach in the classroom big important ideas about. I mean, I teach constitutional law. I teach a course on the political theory of capitalism. I teach American political thought. But we read. I mean, the big thing is we read the original text, right? I when we go down political theory of capitalism, we read The Wealth of Nations. Not just excerpts, not a secondary source about Adam Smith, but we read Adam Smith and dig into it and talk about it and say, what are the right and wrong ideas here? What has he got to say? What is his unique insight? And then we do the same across all these other authors. They read Plato, they read Aristotle, they read all the way across the sort of Western canon, as it's called, and do so while they can also, take take the kinds of classes that parents are willing to pay the money that's now required to go to university, or to borrow the money, I suppose, in some cases, but to make it a balanced education, really like a liberal arts core within whatever else you want to do with your college education. Um, and the results have just been amazing. I mean, not only do we recruit really good students because we have that selective process of the scholarship, but the kind of interest and ambition of these young men and women it has really amazed me. Like what they've gone on to do, they've done, incredible things. So that's really rewarding as well. That's something I didn't see before. Was now I get to know these students as soon as they enter the program, and I interview them. I'm part of the interview team. I get to know them, but then I see them develop, and I interact with them throughout their 4 years, and then see where they go. And that's something I'd never had before in the university education. So I'm really fortunate that the Lyceum program allows that.